We were talking in the last segment about false consciousness, and I wanted to continue with that now. So the relationship between class consciousness and false consciousness, or the difference between them. So what we're really saying is that one of the ways that capitalism perpetuates itself, right, is by somehow short-circuiting, if I can use that kind of terminology, short-circuiting the political potential of the working class to defend itself, right? In other words, to resist its own exploitation. And one of the ways that's accomplished is through the creation of false consciousness among the working class. So if class consciousness is a commonly held awareness that we're kind of all in the same boat, that we all belong to the same class, and therefore we have similar interests, then that's going to define our political interests as well, and lead us, right, to promoting those interests, defending them, acting to defend them somehow. The capitalist class is a class-conscious class, and they, according to Marx, use the state, right, for example, as a way to promote their own interests as a class. How does the capitalist class keep the working class from becoming a class-conscious class? That's going to be a very, very important thing for Marx, right? Again, because it has to do with sort of short-circuiting the political potential, right, of the working class to resist its own oppression. So, one of the ways that we can now then define false consciousness, I want to read here from this book by Tim Delaney. I've made some references to this book throughout the semester, but the way that Tim Delaney defines false consciousness here, according to Marx, is that false consciousness refers to the inability to see clearly, right, where one's own best interests lie. Because Marx believed that once the exploited class comes to recognize its exploitation, that they will act to end it, right? So what has to happen is capitalism tries to, or capital, right, rationalizes itself. I'm not saying this very well, but capitalism rationalizes itself by producing beliefs and myths and ideologies, right, that either justify the system, make it seem rational, or make it seem unavoidable, or maybe another way to think it is that it distracts people's attention from what the real issues are, from what the real real problems in society are. So for example, we live in and we got to remember this base superstructure relationship, right? Capitalism creates its culture, and that the culture of capitalism, its beliefs and ideologies and so forth, are going to reflect or manifest that very fundamental class relationship that is, so important, right, to society. So, for example, right, we live in a society where one of our core values, is individualism. Well, if we are strong believers in individualism, then that would make it very hard for us to recognize that we actually are part of classes, right, or that class is even real. That would be a distraction. Okay, Marx talked about religion, right, as one of these distractions, one of these sort of sources of false consciousness in capitalist society. So he says, he has a quote in another of his works where he says, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It is the heart of a heartless world. It is the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the masses. So it's one of the more famous quotes in Marx's work. And what he was, what he was talking about was, what he claimed anyway, what he was claiming was that religion serves as a distraction from people's actual plight, So you're going to imagine in the context in which he's writing, which is 19th century industrial England, workers are working 6 days a week, 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours a day in these horrible factories, right? And living under just terrible circumstances, living in hovels and suffering, greatly. And but then once a week they're in church, right? And they're being told from the pulpit that their reward is not here, right? Their reward is not here. Their reward is in the next world, right? The reward will come in heaven, and the way to get that reward is to just be good, right? And to not disturb things, and to be a suffering servant, right? To suffer. That suffering leads us there, okay? And so that's what he was talking about. Religion as an opium of the masses, that it comforts people in their misery and it's a distraction for them, okay? So even Delaney, right, is talking about Marx's whole criticism of religion, and I might come back to it in a little while, but Delaney says Marx was against religion for three reasons. First, he believed that religion was a distraction for man from his essence. Second, he felt that while man was in this distracted state, he allowed himself to become shamefully exploited and controlled. And third, because man is being distracted, exploited, and controlled, he loses sight of his human essence, right, of his species being. So we have this whole idea of false consciousness, okay, and ideology. What kinds of ideologies does capitalism generate to justify itself? There are probably all kinds, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the institutional side of this in a capitalist society. So I need to pause here for a second. Okay, so where do these ideas come from? Where do these ideologies, these rationalizations, these myths and so forth, where do they come from? Okay, well, they come from class. They come from the nature of class. The people, he's going to tell us, right, that the people who control the means of production also are the ones who are in the best position to define, right, what the values of society are going to be, right, what is considered a normal belief, okay? So I want to read you a quote, right, that comes from the German ideology. So here's Marx talking about the generation, how ideologies are generated, or from what they are generated. So he says, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Stop right there, okay? The ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas, right? The ruling class's ideas are the ones that dominate society. That's what he's saying, okay? So the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force, right? The class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are, on the whole, subject to it. So let me stop there again. So the class that controls the means of material production, the class that controls the means of production, right? The class that controls the factories and the railroads and the mines and everything else, the class that controls capital, in this case, also controls the means of mental production, the means for producing ideas, okay? So let's finish and then we'll talk a little bit more. All right. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relations. The dominant material relations grasped as ideas, hence the relations which make the one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. So generating the ideas that justify the dominance of the ruling class or distract us from that or rationalize it somehow or make it sound unavoidable or whatever it might be. Okay? So the class that controls the means of material production also controls the means of mental production. What are the means of mental production? Well, they're, all these institutions that are involved in the generation of ideas. So the state, right? The state, the education system, right? Today we would talk about maybe the education system, and there have been Marxist sociologists who look at the education system as a way that reproduces the class system, including the generation of justifying ideologies, rationalizations. But maybe today we would also talk about the media, right? The media, the news media, the entertainment media, and so on. Back in Marx's day, it wasn't the mass media like it is today, right? Back in Marx's day, he would have been talking about the control of publishing houses, right, and so on, newspapers, etc., journals, right, and all those things, which themselves, right, are capitalist enterprises, right, selling books and magazines and newspapers for the purpose of making a profit, okay? But today, now we would also talk about the mass media, right? Television, movies, Hollywood, right? And how those things generate different kinds of ideas, right? One, maybe one thing we would talk about today might be how, one of the ways that workers are prevented from forming a kind of unified class consciousness is to use ideology, right, to drive wedges between factions of the working class. So to use ideology to pit different factions of workers against other factions of workers. So native workers against immigrant workers, right? Men workers against women workers, skilled workers against unskilled workers, racism, right? Black workers against white workers, and so on. That those things have the effect of driving these wedges, right, between the working class. And so as long as they're fighting each other, it's divide and conquer, right? As long as they're fighting each other, they're not unifying, behind their common plight as members of a common class. They can't see it because these mystifications, right, are in the way of them recognizing their plight. Okay, so there we go. So that's about all I want to say about Marx. Now, let's think about him a little bit. Let's think about Marx a little bit. He's writing in the middle of the 19th century. He died in 1883. And from the time he published Capital to the time that he died, and even beyond that, going into the early part of the 20th century, capitalism had actually changed a lot. And so, one of the things I guess I want to say here as a kind of a caveat is, I don't want to talk about whether or not Marx was right or wrong, or whether you should agree with him or disagree with him. That's going to be kind of up to you, right, to decide. But, there are maybe some places where his work can be criticized. There's probably a lot of places, right, where his work could be criticized. And I want to bring up a couple of them, right? I want to bring up two of them. One of them has to do with, the nature of the class system. And we talked before about the middle class. And remember, Marx believed that the middle class would kind of shrink and disappear, right? And all those people in the middle class would fall into the working class and lead to a really split society, and how that could be, a radicalizing of the working class. Well, Weber came along, and Weber definitely not a Marxist, definitely very critical of Marx. And one of the things that he wrote about was something he called the new middle class, right? So by the time Weber came around, we had seen, right, the rise of giant capitalist monopolies, right, and that what that did was it created a need for a different kind of worker. It created the need for a knowledge worker, right? It created the need for a managerial class. It created a need for a class of civil servants, right? People who basically maybe we could call knowledge workers, that we would maybe see. Wright Mills referred to them as the white collar class, right? The class of professionals, university educated professionals, for example, salaried people, not wage people, but salaried people. And, where Marx said that the middle class would disappear, Weber said, well, what we're really saying is not that, yeah, he was right about that old petty bourgeoisie of independent craftsmen and shopkeepers and stuff like that. Yeah, they're under a lot of pressure, and they are going to probably wither away eventually. But it's not that the middle class is disappearing, it's that it's being transformed, right? It's being transformed from that old middle class into a new middle class, okay? So there's one way, maybe. Now, we could go a little further with that. We could say, well, even this new middle class today, that professional salaried class, is undergoing a certain amount of pressure. Maybe not the way Marx saw it, maybe not the way he anticipated it. But what's happening to that white collar class is basically the same thing that happened to the old blue collar class, right? To the old industrial working class. And that is that they are being replaced by technology, okay? And, computers and cell phones and software and so forth, right? That have cheapened the skills of these professionals, and um, uh, you know is leading to a disappearance of that class. Okay, so maybe Marx wasn't completely wrong, but he wasn't completely right either about that. Right? Weber wasn't completely right about that either. I think they were both just giving their best explanation for the time. Okay. I think another place where we might criticize Marx is I mentioned his theory of religion, right? He talks about religion as the opium of the masses, and basically, I would say, well, Marx was definitely an atheist. He was a committed atheist, and didn't really have much time for religion. And it kind of, just kind of like plays it off, right? Just kind of like dismisses it. Because what he's not recognizing, I don't think, is how religion can actually motivate people to work toward more humane society, right? Work toward more equitable distribution of wealth, for example, or how religion can motivate people to organize for justice, right? Whatever that is, right? So think about the role of religion in the formation of the civil rights movement in the United States, or go to Latin America, look at the history of Latin America, and look at like liberation theology, right? Where religious values become the basis of actual, movements for genuine social change, maybe even for the kind of social change that Marx would have approved of. So maybe he doesn't give religion a fair shot. I don't know. And then, whether or not he was right or wrong about the possibility of socialism is still something that's heavily debated. But I think we have to take his work sort of seriously when it comes to his criticism of capitalism, right? Whether or not it would, whether or not the collapse of capitalism would lead to socialism and all that stuff is maybe debatable, right, or arguable. But he did have something to say about how capitalism works, and I've been reading a lot of stuff out of the Communist Manifesto, and I said earlier that the Communist Manifesto is not his best thing, not as an academic work, because it's highly polemical. It's very much a political pamphlet, meant to be more like like a pep talk, for a political party and for a movement than it is to be an actual analysis, like a scientific analysis. But Marx definitely was looking at capitalism from a scientific point of view. And if you think about his research, all the research that he did, years of research, in writing Capital. He was collecting data, factory production data and all kinds of stuff and analyzing it. So we don't want to make it sound like the Communist Manifesto is his, the be-all and end-all of his work. It much better, intellectually sophisticated, I think I would say, works, right? Scientifically oriented works, okay? But, again, going back to something we said in the beginning of the term, love him or hate him, agree with him or disagree with him, he was important. And the reason why he was important is because of the debate that his work sparked, right? It changed the game. It is the thing that initiates that debate with Marx's ghost that we talked about, and how that debate with Marx's ghost is going to drive for years, right? And I don't think it's stopped yet, right? It's going to drive the course of social science, either as attempts to refute Marx or to revise him or to agree with him, whatever, okay? So he has had, if anything, the reason why we have to look at him and the reason why we have to read him and understand him is because of his impact, right, on social science. All right? And that's all I have. That's all I got. So, boy, that was a long trip, wasn't it? So I hope you all doing well, and take care of yourselves now. All right? Bye-bye.